Welcome to Springfield Celebrates Authors 2022, April. We have Allison Cobb, author of Plastic and Autobiography. Take it away, Allison.
Thanks, Mark. Before I read an excerpt from the book, I'm just going to show a few slides from this project. So I work for an environmental organization, and the project got started about 10 years ago because I kept hearing in my work about plastic pollution. I was hearing things like, and seeing images like this picture of, that you may have seen similar pictures like this of an albatross chick, and its belly is full of plastic that it's ingested. These were a series of photos taken by a photographer named Chris Jordan. I also read news that you may have heard as well about the fact that we all consume about the weight of a credit card in plastic every week. So we all have plastic inside of our bodies. And actually new research has shown that, you know, more and more finding microplastic particles inside of us. So I was thinking about plastic pollution, hearing a lot about it. And then I got an opportunity to visit Hawaii in 2012. And I went to a place called Camilo Point, which is at the southern tip of the big island of Hawaii. And it pokes out into that great Pacific garbage patch that you've probably heard about, swirling current full of plastic. And so a lot of plastic washes up on the shore there, more plastic than I had ever seen in one place in my life. So this is one picture that I took of Camilo, and there's another one there where it's always been a place in Hawaii where things wash up. And in fact, there's lore about the Hawaiian chiefs would get big Douglas fir logs that had washed up from the Pacific Northwest, and that's what they would use to make their canoes. Now it's a lot more plastic than wood. And it's even, those microplastic particles are so small that when I scooped up the sand, I would say it was about half plastic. So that was something that really stuck with me. I also met there an artist named Noni Sanford, who for 30 years has been collecting plastic off that beach and making artworks out of it. So this is Noni with some of her 500 and something umbrella handles that she's collected. She also has a collection of toothbrushes. She made a chandelier out of toothbrushes that she found, and she has an impressive collection of lighters as well. She made a big like hot air balloon out of lighters. So I came back to Oregon after that visit and just started thinking a lot about plastic and seeing it everywhere I went once I got home. Certainly not at the scale of Camilo, but I started taking photographs of plastic I saw on my daily dog walk. So this is obviously plastic inside a storm drain, and we know that the storm drain goes right out to the waterways. I started getting interested because I'm a writer and just the language and imagery of plastic. So I liked this plastic hot cup lid that said "here" on it. Soldier. Six-pack. And then this was something that struck me when I was traveling through an airport, that there was fruit, which already has its own wrapper that was wrapped again in plastic. I'm also fortunate that I get to spend half the year living on the Oregon coast, and I started noticing plastic there as well. Of course, our beaches in Oregon tend to be much cleaner than places out in the Pacific, but you see it everywhere you look. So I started taking photos of plastic on the beach. And then one day, as I was in the midst of just thinking about plastic and writing about it, oh, this is a piece of styrofoam that I saw on the beach in Oceanside, Oregon, and the sun was setting, so it made the styrofoam pink. Then one day, as I was having all these thoughts and thinking about wanting to write about plastic, this big plastic car part showed up in my front yard. A lot of times I bring it when I go to places and read. I didn't bring it this time. It's about this big. And I got really obsessed with it. I decided that I wanted to find out what it was, where it had come from. And I learned that it came from a Honda Odyssey minivan, which was a kind of a great thing for a writer, because then I had an Odyssey. So it led to me, go ahead, Cobalt. it led to me with my family taking a road trip across the United States to try to return this Honda car part to the factory where it originated in Lincoln, Alabama, which is where all of the world's Honda Odyssey minivans are made. And along the way, we visited communities that live in the shadow of plastic plants along the Gulf Coast. So this is, you can go forward, this is pictures of the Dow Chemical Complex in Freeport, Texas. This is one of the largest chemical complexes in the Western Hemisphere. It has one of the world's largest plastic plants. And there are also 12 other plants in the area. So the community is really surrounded by plastic plants. And I met there people like this community leader, Jessie Parker, who's here with her great granddaughter. Jessie, when I met her, was living in the house that her grandfather had built. And she now has had to leave that house along with the rest of her historically Black community and move into a rented apartment because the port there is expanding in order to export more plastic. So there's a huge glut of plastic production happening along the US Gulf Coast. There's been like $200 billion of investments in new plastic plants because there's a lot of cheap oil and gas from fracking, and people need uses for that oil and gas. So plastic is really booming on the Gulf Coast, even as the news is talking more and more about the extent of plastic pollution everywhere on the planet and the problems of climate change. And plastic is very energy intensive to produce. So it really worsens climate change because it sends a lot of emissions into the atmosphere. I also learned in the 10 years of course of writing this book about the links between the atomic bomb and plastic, which was personally interesting to me because I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the atomic bombs were made. My father's a physicist. So I explored some of that history. Plastic was a very integral technology to those bombs. And one of the people I write about in the book that I explore that with is my friend Yukio Kawano, who's a visual artist in Portland, and she's a third generation hibakusha, which means atomic bomb survivor. She's from Hiroshima. So she appears as a character in the book. And another character in the book is another poet named Kathy Jetnil Kishner, who is from the Marshall Islands in the Philippines. And the Marshall Islands, like Hawaii, like other islands in the Pacific, parts of those islands are just inundated with plastic waste coming from China, the US, Canada, Mexico, Japan. The Marshall Islands is also basically drowning because the seas are rising from climate change. So they're looking into what to do about their island. Should they try to raise it? Are they going to need to leave the islands? And then the kind of the third triple whammy for the Marshall Islands is that this is the place where the US tested all of its largest nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s. And it's parts of it are very contaminated. You can't even enter parts of the Marshall Islands. They remain so contaminated, and cancer and other illnesses and diseases are quite high there. In this photo, Kathy is standing on something that locals call the tomb. It's a big concrete cap. What the US did was take all of the most contaminated plutonium waste and put it in a pit there, and then just cover it with a concrete dome. And now that the seas are rising, they're washing inside that dome and washing the plutonium out into the ocean. So lots of kind of a triple whammy challenge facing the Marshall Islands there, all kind of related to me and to plastic in some way through my own biography. And that was kind of my goal with the book. That's why I called it Plastic and Autobiography, is I wanted to look at this vast technology and just link it to my own life and my own body. And that kind of led my exploration through the book. So a lot of the stories are hard. It's easy to feel a little hopeless. But what I found in writing the book is that I made these incredible connections with people that really changed my life. And I feel like we do that all the time. The book really cemented for me how everything we do affects one another. And we have some power in that to make our connections positive. And I really think that that ripples outward and makes a difference in the world. So that was To me, that was a joy of writing the book, was meeting these people and making these connections. So with that, I'll just read a short excerpt from the book so you can get a little bit of a flavor of it. We can, let's see. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Cobalt. My partner Cobalt is running tech. Thank you. I'm going to read a part in which I'm trying to figure out about this car part, and it's a weighty topic, but I also think that I'm funny. So should you desire to laugh, I always enjoy that. This piece is called Desire. The book is written in these short, very short sections. This is a section that's about 3.5 pages. Desire. The car part says Honda in large letters, and it contains other markings, mostly incomprehensible to me. One can ask the internet anything, and it almost always supplies a certain kind of answer, but it had nothing coherent to say about this set of numbers and letters. I asked around a little bit. I emailed this code to people who know something about plastic and something about auto manufacturing. No one could tell me much, but a chemist I know who is an expert on plastics told me that the PEHD, PELD means the car part is made of polyethylene, the most common plastic on the planet. He suggested I try talking to someone at Honda. The nearest Honda manufacturing plant is probably Greensburg, Indiana, 2,000 miles away. But I found something called American Honda Motor Company on Northeast Sandy Boulevard here in Portland. The listing included 2 Portland phone numbers. After getting no answer from the first, I tried the second. This time, a computer picked up with a woman's voice saying, "You have reached American Honda Motors," before giving another number I could call in case of emergency. I hung up. What kind of emergency could someone have that would require calling Honda Motor Company? I decided to try the number. It had a Los Angeles area code. Someone answered after only 2 rings. His voice was so fast and clipped that at first I thought he too was a computer. "Honda Corporate Security, this is Keith. Are you calling to report an emergency?" My first instinct was to hang up, but then I remembered that sometimes calling 911 and hanging up can trigger the cops to come anyway. I imagined some kind of corporate security force, guys in suits, showing up at my door. "Oh," I said, sounding confused, "I guess I have the wrong number." "Okay," said Keith, "that's no problem." He said it in a tone that sounded vaguely threatening, like, "It's not a problem this time," or "It's not a problem, but if he wanted to, he could make it one." I abandoned the direct approach and turned to spying through the internet. Honda Motor Company on Sandy wasn't marked on Google Maps. Street View showed a large square facility, larger than any other building nearby, with a flat white roof punctured by small skylights, many shadowed by what looked like white crosses just beneath the glass. The building bordered a housing development cushioned by a thin line of trees. A meticulously landscaped lawn faced Sandy. Next door was a strip mall with Teeny Foods, Skinny Mint, Strategic Pharmaceutical Solutions, and Portland Specialty Baking. Across the street was Iglesia Nuevos Comienzos. It occurred to me that Google Maps is like starlight. It felt like looking down at what was real right then, but it could just have been an image of something no longer there. On Monday, I tried the Portland number again for American Honda Motor Company. A woman whose name I didn't catch picked up. I told her I found a large Honda part in my front yard. I explained that I was writing a book about plastic and that I'd like to trace the origin of this car part. She listened in silence, then transferred me to the parts department. Selena picked up. I told her my story. She suggested I call Honda corporate headquarters. "What do you make there?" I asked. "We don't make anything here," she told me. "We're a parts supplier for dealers." I decided to be a little persistent. "Do you think that if I brought in the part, you could tell me anything about it?" She sighed. She asked me to tell her what it said. I read her the long strings of numbers. "The first one is a part number," she said. "The rest, I have no idea. These come from Japan." It was a pronouncement that seemed to seal the mystery. Do you think anyone else there might know? She paused a moment. Let me check with my manager. She was gone for a while. I could imagine the conversation taking place in some office nearby. She came back. My manager says, you need to talk to Honda Corporate. They can answer all of your questions and give you everything you're looking for. But I knew that Honda Corporate could not give me everything I was looking for. I brought this dirty plastic car part, this piece of garbage, into our house. It sat in the living room for a long time until Jen asked how long I planned to keep a car part in our living room. I moved it into the bedroom, on the floor near my side of the bed. It made a flat clap against the floorboards when I tripped over it, which I did almost every night. I wanted it to speak to me. I wanted it to tell me something about how to live now on this planet, in this real life as a member of the human species. I wanted it to tell me what to do about being alive in a dying world, where being alive is monstrous, where the terms of every breath seem to be death. I wait. For what? A sign, for an albatross to wake from my chest and take flight. But it remains here with me and this car part, its dirty carapace curled around me, and the industrial chemicals we share, the resonating molecules of our bodies. Thanks. My trip to the Honda factory obviously didn't work out because I still have the car part with me, but you have to read the book to see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yay! I'd like to introduce Aaron Gilbreath with The Heart of California. Yay!
Thank you, everyone. I come from Arizona originally, and there's a lot of words in Spanish, so people don't know what to do with them, but you get effort for trying. It's a lot like dancing. You get effort for trying. It's really great to be here, and it's nice to finally meet you. And one of my favorite things about readings is hearing how people make their books and what they put into their books. 10 years, you said you worked on your book? I mean, that's no short amount of time. It's hard to imagine doing any one thing for 2 years, let alone 10. What I really am excited to hear too is how you connected all these seemingly disparate parts into a story. There's so many books about timely issues like plastic and pollution, and you can go at them straight away. But the sort of creative mind comes at it sideways. And to me, it's one of the joys of reading to see how a mind connects pieces that don't seem connected to tell the story. So I'm pretty excited to read that and think about our troubled world in a new way. This book here, did I pause it by pushing it with something?
No, we had another person turn up.
Hey, person. Thank you. Still feel like, we're in this meeting. We should be talking about water rights and funding of the arts, something. But it is in the library. It's also really wonderful to be in a library again after 2 years. Being deprived of cultural events, public places like this is great. I marked my page here with my royalty check, which shows that I'm still in the negative. I use that as a bookmark to remind me that we don't do a lot of this for money. We do it because it's important. And I took 20 years to write this book too. It's basically a weaved narrative that is a portrait of a place in California, the center of California. California is basically a valley ringed by mountains. I wrote about the San Joaquin Valley, which is half of the center of it. It produces about 25% of country's produce, depending on how you measure it. Some of the fastest growing cities in this gigantic state. It's hugely populated and lots of challenging problems: population, water, consumption, loss of topsoil, salinization of productive farmland, and air pollution. It's flat. It's very strongly scented. Some people would say smelly. And it puts a lot of people off because people drive through it and they think nothing's happening here. It's flat and stinky and it's just a bunch of farms and it's so easy to dismiss. But I'm sort of a fan of the underdog, and California being the great state that it is, you know, writ large and global culture, inventing skateboards and all sorts of things. It's amazing that this center of it is so easily dismissed because it's sort of the anti-California. So what I did was write a portrait of the valley through a weave narrative. I followed a historian through the valley. His name was Frank Lotta. He was a regional historian and an oral historian, so he really liked hearing people talk. That was his thing. He recorded people, early settlers, Native Americans, and would self-publish these books. Him and his wife, Jeanette, they would go out in the field and do this work together. And then they would publish these incredible historical books. But in 1938, the valley flooded. And if you've ever been between Bakersfield and Sacramento, you don't really think about floods. If you think about water, you think about the lack of water, rather than the ability to take a boat trip through the place. So he waited, and when it flooded in 1938, he was able to take a boat with four students of his. He was a teacher, so he took 4 students with him. And they boated from Bakersfield to San Francisco, which seems completely insane, totally impossible. But it was possible, and they walked very few parts of that they have to walk the boat around, so they mostly floated. And so when I first saw that, I don't remember where I saw that, but I thought, that's wild. And I couldn't find any other information about it. There was just not a lot available. I found some old Bakersfield, California newspaper articles about his trip that covered it, but they were so small and they were really lacking in information, kind of more of a tease than anything informative. So I filed those away and just thought, why is there nothing written about this? And so the backstory is that I've been trying to write about this valley since I first experienced it in college in 1995. My best friend, Dean, and I were taking a road trip from Arizona, where we grew up to Vancouver, BC and back for a month, sleeping in my dad's van. So we just camped and slept in the van and slept in tents and explored and hiked and saw new parts of the world. And on the way home, after stinking up the place for a month, we were driving back to his brother's place in Santa Monica, and we dropped down out of the mountains on I-5, and all of a sudden the mountains just disappeared and the horizon disappeared. And granted, we were a little hazy from some of our bad habits back then, and we thought, did we just go the wrong way? We thought we were driving east into Nevada, into the desert, because the horizon just became brown, and we didn't realize there was anything so big and so flat. It felt like we were in the Great Plains. And so, of course, we wanted to get out of there because it was hot and smelly. We wanted to get to the cool part of California, like the beach. So we kept driving. But when we got home back to Phoenix, I couldn't stop thinking about this place. It was so strange because it was so big and we didn't realize it even existed. And it was so visceral. The experience of driving through a place like that was like being in a cathedral. It was these vaulted ceilings. It was just all sky and horizon. And that was it. And so I got back to Arizona and I couldn't stop thinking about this place. And so I did some research, and the fact that I was also sort of a developing writer at the time, I really wanted to write. I was a college kid and I was confused, but I also really like this writing thing. So I thought, I can write about this place. And 20 years later, here I am with this book. I'm a 46-year-old father. So it was just a place that really fascinated me and confounded me, and I wanted to understand it, but I also couldn't figure out a way to write about it. So I tried all these different ways. I wrote essays and I jotted down chapters and I outlined things. And sometimes I focused on animals and ecology, and other times I focused on road tripping, but nothing really clicked. And then I found this boat trip story, Frank Lotta's boat trip from 1938. And I thought, well, that's the way to write about it. So I decided I would follow his route. It was very easily mapped out. In fact, he drew a map from Bakersfield to Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. And I thought, I'll follow that. And, but then something happened and I just got so frustrated. I was like, I give up. I can't do this. There was something about the whole project that was beyond me. So I wrote a letter to this author named William Vollmann. I'm not sure if anybody out there has heard of Mr. Vollmann, but he writes these big, huge books about, violence and poverty, these big topics. And he lives in Sacramento, and he'd written about water and he'd written about desert environments. And so I just out of nowhere wrote him a letter and said, "Dear Mr. Vollmann, I've been writing about this place. The boat trip is fascinating. No one's written about it. I hope somebody does. I tried. I can't. Maybe you would like it." And I sent him a letter. And then months passed. And one day my wife and I got back to our apartment, and she pulled this envelope out of the mail. And there was this like scribble mark in the corner. And it looked like, I don't know, it looked like somebody had just shaved their poodle and glued the hair to the return address. It was just scratched out. And she goes, do you know somebody in Sacramento? And I said, no. And then I realized, oh, I think that's Bowman. So we went upstairs. He sat down and opened up the letter, and he'd written me back. And he basically said what my wife wisely said, which was, well, you give up, but have you gone down there and retraced his step yet? The boat trip yet? And I thought, no. And he said, I could write this, meaning he could probably write anything if he tried. But he suggested if he was doing it, he would go down there, he would retrace it as many times as he needed to. He would read as much as he possibly could about the place, and he would just keep trying until he got it right. And he would follow his instincts and his passion, I think he said, and then it would be entirely his. So why shouldn't I do the same? And my wife looked at me and goes, that's what I told you. And she had. So I bought a plane ticket, and I booked 2 weeks of a reporting trip. What nobody really knew that I was interviewing when I was down there was that I was sleeping in my car because I didn't have any money. So I would wake up in my car, fix my hair, and put on something clean and go interview people. And after that, it took me years to really transcribe everything and start to shape it all. And then we decided to have a kid. And after the third trimester, we had it was a third ultrasound. We were driving back from the hospital, and my wife said, well, you got 20 weeks to finish this thing. And I thought, all right, let's get cracking. So I did. And it was the best deadline ever. And I put my daughter Vivian's name in here, and my dad's, who was a big supporter of me and this project because he was in love with the West. And I'd like to read what is my favorite, and it was probably his favorite chapter too, just real briefly about Tulare Lake. The valley itself is about 265 miles long, 47 miles wide on average, 75 at its widest, so it's huge. And this lake called Tulare Lake was the biggest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. And it's not there anymore. And it's mostly not there in the cultural consciousness either. Institutional memory has sort of been erased. So people who live right by there don't even know it even existed. And it's funny because not only did it exist, but the topography was named after lakey things. Like there was a turtle cove, and now it's just dry as a bone. So I thought that was a pretty fascinating contrast. I'll start with Lotta's journey. One of the things I did was try to recreate his journey. Because the record was so thin, I just decided to recreate it in a historical sort of fictionalized narrative. So you're actually there on the ground with Lotta as he boats through this valley that is essentially erased and extinct, and all the native people's culture that went with it. And they were called the Yokuts people, and he knew quite a bit about them because he just really admired their life. They lived this peaceful life. And so by recreating his journey through the valley, I tried to recreate the historical valley that the Yokuts people lived in, and weave that with my own 2014 journey during the drought. So on Monday, June 19th, 1938, the second day of Lotta's trip, the winds blew dangerously hard. So his crew waited in the marshlands outside the town of Lost Hills until conditions improved. Lotta probably welcomed the delay since his injuries that he suffered from hitting a bridge were still bothering him. As his boat, the Alta, weathered Sunday's storm, winds uprooted trees in Bakersfield and left some residents without power. On nearby Buena Vista Lake, which Lotta's crew had just passed through, a teenager sailboat was blown into an offshore willow. To keep the boat from flipping over, the owner, Lee Waller, stuck out his foot, but the impact severed his toe, and he and his 17-year-old friend spent the night hanging on 2 tree branches. At 3 a.m, Waller's parents realized he hadn't come home, and after finding his car on the shore of Buena Vista Lake, they woke up the deputy sheriff in Taft, and the officers searched the lake in a motorboat at sunrise until they found the boys. No oil derricks were down the Bakersfield, California road. Agricultural damage was slight, and the levees protecting the town of Alpa from overflow waters of the Kern River withstood the waves thrown up by the wind. When the winds had died down, Lotta and his crew resumed their trip, and on the third day of their journey, they entered Tulare Lake. The years 1862, 1868, 1906, and 1916 were some of the San Joaquin Valley's flood years, but the land had even more dry years than that. Until 1937, the lack of sufficient snowmelt in the nearby Sierra Nevada had kept Tulare Lake dry for 13 straight years. When melting snow finally started filling the lake bed in 1938, The many levees that ringed it could no longer hold back the volume of water rushing from those rivers, and the water spread across wheat and barley fields, washing away houses and farmers' sheds. Then summer descended. In the marshes along the lake's edge, during flood years, summer heat turned the warm, shallow water of vile green. Without depth or strong currents to circulate it, sediment collected. It grew thick with mud and algae. Frogs left clouds of squirming larvae, while fallen bulrushes decayed in the water that collected the bodies of innumerable insects. In October 1861, geological surveyor William Henry Brewer described the lake marshes as, quote, unhealthy and infested with mosquitoes in incredible numbers and unparalleled ferocity. Lauda knew Yokute's history, so he knew that by 1833, that same malarial mosquitoes helped wipe out approximately 3/4 of the Yokute's population. Yet the monsoons of tool gnats, flies, and mosquitoes that filled the air as their boat entered the lake also astounded Lauda. It was impossible not to marvel at the lake's dimensions, not just the water's unbelievable volume, but the scale of life and death in it. At sunset, millions of bats filled the air to feast on insects. During the day, the sun cooked the murky shallows, and its sulfurous smells traveled far on the breeze, like the thousands of pelicans, ducks, and geese who carried stolen stalks of wheat from nearby fields. But out on the deep lake, there was no vile green, no muck or feasting mosquitoes. Here the warm breeze blew fresh over the crew's sweaty faces. Visibility was high. The scent of dry grass and moisture filled the air, and the cooler water took on a clean silver sheen. It reached 10, 20, 40 feet deep, and the fish cut wide courses through the depths, swimming above sunken grain threshers and fences built by farmers whose respect for the Great Lake had diminished during its 13 dry years. Despite the dangers, this day was probably one of the crew's most wondrous. No one was there to record it but Lauda, and whatever journal he kept, I wasn't able to locate. So I could only imagine how the hours passed on their boat. I pictured Lauda jotting notes and studying his maps as his young crewmates Don, Ernest, and Richard tried to keep the boat on a northeasterly course, swinging their oars in circles and feeling for a bottom that always lay beyond reach. Lauda would look up to tell them to hang on to those paddles. Those are the only ones they had. Desert winds whipped up whitecaps, and in places, schools of fish ruffled the water like waves. The larger ones' backs occasionally broke the surface, startling the boys as the boat rocked side to side. They wrapped their fingers around those wooden edges when they kneeled for a closer look. They didn't want to fall in. What all lives down there? Ernest asked. Lauda smiled. Nothing that will eat you, he said. Those were only suckers, chubs, and maybe a sturgeon, what the Yokutes called cowcuts. The boys nodded, but their hands gripped until their knuckles went white, because when they looked up, they saw water in all directions. No shore, no reeds, nothing but a single shimmering 360-degree horizon and the hazy shape of mountains hovering in the distance. To Ernest and Richard, the view looked like Pismo Beach, though somehow Fresno only lay 50 miles away. On the 5th day of my trip following Lauda, I got off Interstate 5 and stopped at the In-N-Out Burger in Kettleman City. Kettleman is a town of 1,400 people halfway between LA and San Francisco, and its name reveals frontier ambitions that it hasn't lived up to. When I asked the staff member cleaning the bathroom if he'd heard of the old Tulare Lake bed, his lips pinched and he shook his head. Never heard of it, he said, wiping the table with a paper towel the top of the paper towel dispenser. I said, well, the old shoreline is supposed to be right around here somewhere. He said he'd only lived around here for 2 years and he was still getting his bearings. The burger chain built this location 20 years ago, though. The building, he said, and maybe the parking lot. Lake water had left marks on that very space. During average wet years, Tulare Lake had stretched 75 miles north and south and 25 miles east and west, about 200,000 acres. Its wettest year was 1862, with depths reaching 41 feet. And the thing is, Tulare Lake had no average year. It was a desert puddle and a drying period between ice ages. Some summers it shrunk to what the Lemoore Leader newspaper called, quote, a huge mud hole, leaving millions of rotting fish piled along the receding shore as locals collected the live ones. Other years it stayed wet. Early gold miner John Baker told Frank Lauda that the lake in 1862 was, quote, 40 miles wide and 60 miles in length. And when Lotta mapped the 1862 shoreline from various accounts that he collected, his calculations put the towns of Corcoran and Stafford 25 feet underwater and the North Shore in what he called the center of the town of Lemoore. The part of Kettleman City that now serves interstate travelers hamburgers and the lattes that I drank sat safely atop what was called Orton Point in the 1850s. Named for Tulare Lake rancher Julius Orton, the point overlooked the valley. It's the first real rise of land modern drivers encounter while headed north from the Grapevine Grade. And although mosquitoes and the stink of dead fish would have reached it back then, water would not. But over the course of millennia, the minerally lake had left long horizontal stains somewhere around the burger joint. And if you looked, supposedly, you could find them. I'd driven a few small roads on both sides of the interstate and hiked up 2 hills in search of those colored bands, but I hadn't found anything. Had I misread my source? Maybe the stain wasn't on a hill, but on a low sandy rise like the one in Lotta's photo in his book, Little Journeys, which looked like nothing more than the slightly upturned edge of a dry desert creek. But when I ordered a hamburger at the counter, I asked the young cashier if he'd heard of Tulare Lake. He shook his head and smiled. No, I'm sorry, he said. I don't know where that is. I explained that it was right here, that we were standing on its western edge and that it was once the biggest lake west of the Great Lakes. Handing him my money, I described how during wet years, the water stretched from the town of Corcoran on the east side to here. His tan brows raised and hung there. A lake that big, he said? No, man, that's the first I've heard of it. The information surprised him so much that he seemed to want to know more, but other customers had stepped behind me. So I got out of line and waited for my order. Granted, fast food workers might not have been the best people to ask. These were teenagers, not farmers or historians, but the sun was setting, so I didn't really have much time. And really, these people deserved to know, since it was the lake that had left unsafe levels of arsenic and boron in the 2 wells that provided their drinking water. As the sky darkened further, I pulled into the Starbucks drive-thru. Hello, welcome to Starbucks, said the voice in the speaker. What can I get started for you? I asked about Tulare Lake. Yes, the woman said. Are you asking me where it is? I said. Well, you're slightly on the wrong side of the valley for that, she said. You do need to go a little more towards Tulare, over like on the 43. So you're going to travel north on 41, she said, until you see the town of Kansas. If you Google it or on Yahoo or whatever, then Kansas will take you to the 43. Tulare is on that side. So Tulare Lake. I don't even know if it's called that anymore, but it's over on that side of the valley. I was shocked. So far, she knew more about it than anyone. Her name was Gina. She was the manager. I pushed for more info. Was there still a lake there? Not that I know of, she said. I haven't traveled on that side of the valley for a long time. She lived on the west side right now. And since she knew so much, had she ever heard anybody mention where you could see the lake's old mineral stains here in Kettleman City? No, she said, in a voice that signaled that either I was a total idiot or that I wasn't listening. Because you're 2 hours from the coast, she said, so I'm not sure where the shoreline would be. She was losing patience with me. I explained the lake size in historic terms real quick, how it stretched. And she said, oh, I'm not sure. I thanked her a lot and drove off. She gave very specific details, but she still had it wrong. That was okay. Unlike the others, she at least made an educated guess about my lake and my weird questions. It was a smart leap, and it was revealing. There's arguably no landscape in America that agriculture and water diversion have changed more fundamentally than that Tulare Lake Basin. In 2004, a report from the U.S. Geological Survey categorized Tulare Lake as one of California's, quote, discontinued lakes and reservoirs, as if the West's largest lake was an unpopular brand of frozen pizza. And as I drove off, I kept trying to imagine what Lotta would think of this world where Tulare Lake didn't form the center of the local psyche, a feature that had loomed as large as the Sierra Nevada on early California maps and had dominated the lives of the settlers he'd interviewed in the early 1900s. I'm just going to read for a couple more paragraphs. As Lotta's crew marveled at the wonders on the lake, they also got lost. The Alta was supposed to dock at the town of Alpa on Monday night. When he never showed, people got nervous. The secretary of the Kern County Chamber of Commerce was one of Lotta's main contacts on this trip. And during the trip, Lotta planned to stop in certain towns and call him to report. On Monday, Hoffman told the newspaper that he hadn't heard from Lotta. And on Tuesdays, officials got ready to send a small plane out to search for him. I'll stop there. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Will they find Lana or not?
I had a quick question I'd like to ask. Like,
Sure.
Is there any of the journey that you can still take by boat?
No, not the way he did. The thing is, if you know the shape of the place, basically it runs north and south, from Bakersfield towards Sacramento. And on the east side of it is a parallel mountain range, and that's where all the rivers come. They flow off of that west, and then they meet in the center and flow north towards the San Francisco Bay. And so all of those little spaces between the Sierra Nevada rivers had sort of connected in these marshlands, and their banks had flooded. So it was like an enormous sheet of water. And it doesn't do that anymore, because one of the things I didn't get to read in here was that all of those rivers have been dammed for agriculture and for urbanity, and under the guise of flood control and stuff. But primarily it was to control the water so that people could grow food and control wealth, because of course water in the West is wealth. And because of that, the natural hydrological cycle and the structure of the whole valley no longer resembles itself. And partly, if you had removed the dams on a lot of those rivers, the Kern, there probably still wouldn't be enough water to create anything like what he'd experienced, and even in small sections. What you can do is you can jump in your canoe in the Kern River and take a little trip along part of it, but only as it flows west. And there's a section of the San Joaquin River in the middle, which contains all those Sierra rivers, where there's literally no water at all. It's just dirt. I think mostly sand even. The water just stops. And so it's like, I wouldn't even know what to compare it to. Basically, it's like the desert creeks where I grew up, where obviously river water flows there during like floods and monsoon storms and stuff, but not on any regular basis. Well, it used to flow there on a regular basis. So it's like an ancient memory, and that's why his trip was sort of the embodiment of the place itself. The whole original landscape is just an ancient memory. So now,
Thank you so much to Allison Cobb and Aaron Gilbreath. They are both nominees for the Sarah Winnemucca Award for Creative Nonfiction for the Oregon Book Awards presented by Literary Art. Kesha Ajose Fisher is the host this year. She actually spoke last month here as well at this very podium. So we're very excited for that. Thank you so much to Literary Arts for again supporting Springfield Celebrates Authors 2022. Thank you again to the Friends of the Springfield Public Library and the Springfield Public Library Foundation for supporting Springfield Celebrates Arts every year. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming today. Have a great day, and we will see you again for Springfield Celebrates Authors 2023.